Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the distinguished public lecture by Professor Justin If Lin. Professor Lin is the former Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank, and also the Honorary Dean of the National School of Development at Peking University. My name is Leona Lee. I'm a PhD student here at the Economics Department at CUHK. Today, it is our great honor to have invited Professor Lin to give us a lecture on our university campus. Now, may I first invite Professor Joseph Song, Vice Chancellor and President of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, to give us a welcoming speech and introduce the speakers for us. Please, Professor Song.
Professor Lin, Mrs. Lin, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. First of all, a very warm welcome from the Chinese University. We are here very honored and privileged to have our distinguished speaker, Professor Justin Lin, to be our guest of honor today. Professor Lin is Dean of National School of Development at Peking University and the former Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank. Professor Lin is a corresponding fellow of the British Academy and a fellow of the Academy of Sciences for Developing World. He was awarded honorary doctoral degree by 5 universities in Europe, USA, and Hong Kong. Today, Professor Lin is going to deliver a lecture on his area of expertise entitled Demystifying the Chinese Economy. I'm extremely grateful for him to come to our campus to deliver this speech. Let us give a warm welcome to Professor Lin. Before Professor Lin starts his lecture, I would like to demystify his legendary life to our audience. Professor Lin was born in Taiwan and graduated from Taiwan's Chengchi University in 1978. He left Taiwan in 1979, in a way that I'm sure you and I know, and studied Marxist economist in Beijing University. He received a fellowship from the University of Chicago after being a one-day English interpreter for the visiting Nobel laureate Theodore Schwartz in 1982, and he started to pursue studies in economics at the University of Chicago and obtained his PhD within 4 years. Unlike most PhD students who stay in the US after graduation, Professor Lin actually returned to China immediately after 1-year postdoctoral fellowship and his research at the Yale University. And he began his research work on China's agricultural and economic reform. In 1994, he founded the China Center for Economic Research at Peking University and served as director for 15 years. The CCER, now upgraded to the National School of Development, has attracted many renowned scholars and researchers who have made significant contribution to both China's economy and development and advanced studies of Chinese economy. Building on his distinguished career as one of China's leading economists, Professor Lin was selected as the Senior Vice President and the Chief Economist of the World Bank in 2008. He was the first person from a developing country to take up this position. And as a Chinese, we are very proud of you. Professor Lin guided the World Bank's intellectual leadership and played a key role in shaping the economic research agenda of the institution. One particular contribution is that he promoted the role of China in the global economy by unveiling China's successful experience to many other developing economies that are eager for the growth recipes. Professor Lin is well known for his work on agricultural reform, fiscal decentralization, enterprise reform, and economic development and growth in general. He is the author of 23 books, including The China Miracle, Development Strategy and Economic Development, The Quest for Prosperity, and many others. He has also published more than 100 articles in refereed international journals and collected volumes of economic development and growth. In 2007, he gave the prestigious Marshall Lecture at Cambridge, and in 2011, the Simon Kuznets Lecture at Yale, and the UNU Wider Annual Lecture in Mozambique, in the first ever held in a developing country. As a leading Chinese economist, Professor Lin has played an important role in China's economic modernization and its status in the economic world. He is currently a representative of the China's People's Congress and the vice chairman of the All China Federation of Industry and Commerce. He also rendered his professional expertise to major international organizations, including the UN Millennium Task Force on Hunger, the Eminent Persons Group of the Asian Development Bank. In fact, I can still go on and on for many hours for his resume, but I would not waste your time to listen to this very insightful talk. Please join me to welcome Professor Lin.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction by Vice Chancellor Song. And ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to come back to Chinese University of Hong Kong because I was here in 2008 before I went to the World Bank. And I just finished my job at the World Bank. So I think it's time for me to come back to share with you some of my insight. And this time, will be on the Chinese economy. We know that China started its transition from a planning economy to a market economy in 1979. At that time, China was a very poor country. Its per capita income was less than 1/3 of the average in African countries. But in the past 33 years, the annual growth rate in the Chinese economy reached 9.9% per year, continuously for more than 30 years. And by that, last year, the per capita income in China reached $5,400. And most likely, this year, the per capita income in China will be around $6,000. And China now per capita income is about 5 times of the average of the African countries. And in effect, we never observed a country to have such a high growth rate continuously for such a long time. And the transition is not only reforming the domestic economy. The transition is also related to opening up of the Chinese economy to the world. And by that, we can measure the openness of the Chinese economy by the so-called trade dependence ratio. That is import plus export as a percentage of Chinese GDP. In 1979, it was only 9.5%. That means China export about 8.7% of its GDP, its product, and imported about 4.8% of its GDP. But in the past 32 years, the average annual growth rate of trade in China reached 17% per year. And the trade volume in China increased more than 170 times in the past 3 decades. And now China became the second largest trading nation in the world, the largest exporters in the world. And if we use the trade dependent ratio to measure the openness of the Chinese economy, it is now over 50% of the Chinese GDP. And it is highest among the large economies because for the US, although it's the #1 trading country in the world, its trade-dependent ratio is around 25%. And now China is more than 50%. And during these 3 decades, such a rapid economic development made a very important contribution to the poverty reduction in the world. More than 600 million people get out of poverty in the past 3 decades. And this number is very significant because, as I mentioned, as the Vice Chancellor mentioned, I was the senior vice president and the chief economist of the World Bank. And the major mission of the World Bank is poverty reduction. But if we took this 600 million people out of the picture, the number of people in the world who are trapped in the poverty did not decline since the Second World War. So China made a very important contribution to the poverty reduction in the world. And not only in terms of poverty reduction, China also made a very important contribution to the prosperity in the world, and it demonstrated by in 1998, during the East Asian financial crisis, and the shock to the East Asian economies was so severe. Most people at that time thought the East Asian economy would take decades to recover. But because China did not devalue its currency and provide the stability, at the same time China grew very rapidly, so helped other East Asian economies to stabilize and to continue their dynamic economic growth, even after 2 years of the crisis. And the other one was in 2008, global financial crisis. China was the first country to get out of this crisis because in the first quarter of 2009, China already started to recover. It was because of this fiscal stimulus of 4 trillion yen. But the issue is that during the past 30 years, most time people expect Chinese economy to collapse because in spite of all this extraordinary performance, most people did not have confidence on the Chinese economy because China did not follow the policy recommendation that prevail in the world. And so, in the early 1980s, even China already grew at about 9% for more than a decade. People predict the Chinese economy would collapse soon. And that kind of prediction repeated. And recently, that kind of prediction emerged again. So in this talk, I'd like to share with you my understanding of the Chinese economy. The first one was how come China could achieve such a rapid economic growth rate since the economic transition started? How come it was possible? And the second question I'd like to share with you is that how come China could not have a similar economic performance before the economic transition in 1979? If economic transition is the magic for China's success, then the question is that why other transitional economy could not have similar performance as the Chinese economy during the transition period? Because we know most other transitional economy in East European country, former Soviet Union, they collapse, stagnant for a long time. And my first question is that what kind of prices China paid to its success? Because everything has two sides. There are some achievement, but there are also some drawbacks. And what are the drawbacks? And what are the reasons for that, and how to deal with that? And the fifth question is very important for many young people here. Can China maintain such a type of dynamic economic growth in the coming years? Because as I mentioned recently, there's a lot of prediction that Chinese economy will collapse soon again. Whether that kind of prediction has some valid point or not, whether China can continue its dynamic economic growth in the coming years. And my last question is that, will other developing countries have similar performance? Or can they have a similar performance as the Chinese economy? Because our goal is prosperity, not only for the Chinese people. We also hope other people can have a similar prosperities. But can they duplicate the success of Chinese economy? Those are the 6 questions I'd like to share with you. Regarding the dynamic economic growth, we need to know it's a modern phenomenon. Because before the 18th century, in effect, every country in the world, including the Western European country, now they are the so-called advanced developed country. Before 18th century, their economic growth rate was extremely slow. According to some historians like Angus Madison and others, their studies show before 18th century, the annual growth rate of the per capita income was only about 0.05% per year. What does it imply? It means that it took 1,400 years for countries in Western European areas like Britain, like Netherlands, like Germany, like France, to double their per capita income, 1,400 years. But entering into the 18th century up to the mid-19th century, the rate of income growth accelerated 20 times, from 0.05% to 1% per year. And that means that it took about 70 years to double per capita income. And from the late 19th century to the 20th century, or up to the financial crisis, the rate of income growth in those advanced countries doubled again, from 1% per year to about 2% per year. And that means that it took 31 years for them to double the per capita income. And we also know, before the 18th century, the world was quite flat in terms of the difference in per capita income. Even the advanced countries at the time, like Netherlands and so on, their per capita income was only about 4 times or 5 times of the poorest country in the world at the time. But after the 18th century, other countries did not accelerate their income growth as the advanced country in Europe, so the income gap widened. And so we need to understand how come, from a very flat world, all of a sudden, the Western European country first, then North America country, follow. They accelerate their growth. Well, now we know. I think most of you know the answers. It was the Industrial Revolution in the mid-18th century. And after the Industrial Revolution, technological innovation accelerated. And a structural transformation, the relocation of the production from backward agrarian to manufacturing sectors to service sectors accelerated also. And those kind of acceleration increased the level of productivity and allow income to grow faster. And that was the secret. But if technological innovation is the secret for the success of the advanced countries, then for the developing country, they could have some kind of advantage because their backwardness, in effect, is some kind of their advantage because for the high-income country, they are on the global technological frontier. For them to have a technological innovations means that they need to do the R&D. They need to do the invention by themselves. And that is a very costly and a risky business. And for the developing country, their technologies are backward. But it means what? in their technological innovation, they can imitate, they can borrow, they can licensing the technology from the advanced country. If they know how to do that, the cost of technological innovation and the risk of technological innovation would be much lower, and they can grow much faster. And after the Second World War, there were 13 economies in the world. They tapped into the potential and achieved 7% and more growth rate continuously for 25 and more years. And so my answer to the first question is that after 79, China became one of those 13 economies which tap into the potential of the advantage of backwardness in the process of technological innovation, industrial upgrading, and that allow China to achieve those 9.9% growth rate continuously for more than 30 years. But if the advantage of backwardness is the reason for the success since 79, then we need to ask, advantage of backwardness has been there for centuries. And how come only after 79, China benefits from that advantage of backwardness? I think it was because of the development strategy that China adopted before 1979. Because we know the Communist Party took over China in 1949 and started the national building in 1952, and with a whole series of 5 years plan. And at that time, the goal of the development in China was to overtake Britain in 10 years and to catch up US in 15 years. That means what? China wanted to set up, build up the most advanced industries, technologies, as Britain, as the US at that time. And certainly, they were the advanced country, they were the technological leaders. But if you wanted to immediately use those kind of technologies, they were still protected by patent. And more importantly, most of those technology related to national security. Even you want to pay the cost to buy it, no one wants to sell that to you. So China, at that time, needed to reinvent the wheel. And if you wanted to reinvent the wheel, you gave up the potential advantage of backwardness. You need to pay the same cost as the high-income country in those kind of technological innovation. But things are even worse than that, because advanced industries, technologies, were very capital intensive. And China at that time was a poor agrarian economy. Capital was scarce. So those kind of industry, those kind of technologies were not China's competitive advantages. It was the competitive advantage of the high-income country. And as under that scenario, if China wanted to use those kind of technology, build up those kind of industries, firms in the priority sectors were not viable in open competitive markets. Their investment, as well as their continuous operation, rely on the government protection and subsidies. And those kind of protection subsidies were carried out through all kinds of distortions. By those kind of government intervention, China was able to build up the commanding height, the modern industries. So China was able to test their nuclear weapon in the 1960s. China was able to launch a satellite in the 1970s. However, resources was misallocated from sectors which China can be competitive to sectors which China cannot be competitive. And all the kind of distortion will replace the incentive of the people. So as a result, yes, China was able to own certain modern industries, but the economic performance were extremely poor. So people continue to be very poor. That was the reason. But this is not the situation only in China. All the socialist countries follow similar strategies because they all follow the so-called Stalinist model, wanted to build up the whole set of modern heavy industries on an agrarian basis. And this is a strategy not only followed in a socialist country. In effect, it was a strategy followed by all the developing countries in the world. We know that after the Second World War, most developing countries gained political independence from the colonies, and they started their own pursuit of modern economic development. And at that time, the understanding for a country to be a modern nation, they need to have a modern industries. And the so-called modern industry is those kind of advanced capital-intensive industries. So all the socialist countries and developing countries in the world after the Second World War all follow similar strategies. And they also have similar intervention and distortions. And again, their economic performance were all very poor. So when China started the transition from a planning economy to market economy, all the socialist countries also started their transition. At the same time, other non-socialist countries in Latin America, in Africa, also started their economic reform and transition. However, other countries in the transition process, in general, the economy collapsed and stagnated. And some economists made a careful econometric studies. They found that developing countries as a group, their economic growth rate in the 1980s and 1990s, after their reform, their transition, was lower than their economic growth rate in the 1960s and 1970s. Not only so, their economic crises, economic fluctuations, was even more frequent than the 1960s and the 70s. And so some economists call the 1980s and 1990s were the lost decades for the developing world. And so the performance was very different. And how come the problem that other transitional economies faced were very similar to the problem that China faced? Too many government intervention, too many distortions. And the roots of the problems was also similar. They all wanted to develop up the advanced industries on a poor agrarian basis. And how come the performance was so different? I think you also related to the strategy of transition. We know that other socialist countries and other developing countries, they follow the so-called Washington consensus. Because the diagnosis at that time, for the reason of poor performance in the developing country, in the socialist country, was too many distortions, too much government interventions. And so they thought the reason for the poor performance of the developing country or the transitional economy was the government failures. And so the recommendation was to remove all the distortion by the structural RP, including privatization, marketization, and liberalization. Well, I think the intention of those kind of policy recommendation was good, try to improve the performance of the developing country. However, this policy recommendation forgot one thing. All those kind of distortion was designed to protect the non-viable firms in the auto priority sectors. If you remove all those protection and distortion, that means you remove all those protections and subsidies, right? Then all those non-viable firms would collapse. And they're so huge, they employ 30%, 40% of the labor force in the country. And if you allow them to go bankrupt simultaneously, immediately, you're going to create huge unemployment and induce all kinds of social, political instabilities. Without stability, certainly you cannot have economic growth. And many countries for few of those kind of consequences. After they introduced the Washington Consensus reform, they reintroduced all kind of disguised subsidies and protection from the back doors. And those kind of disguised subsidy and protection were even less efficient than the explicit subsidies and protection they used to have. And that was the reason why the other transitional economy, they did not do well. But we know that China did not follow that kind of strategies. China adopted a gradual dual-track approach. On the one hand, continue to provide some transitory protection and subsidies to the firms in the oil sectors, those kind of large state-owned enterprises. But on the other hand, liberalize the entry to the new sectors which are labor-intensive, which used to be replaced in the past, and encourage private sectors enters and joint ventures and foreign direct investment. So many labor-intensive firms in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and in Korea and so on, they relocate to China. And those kind of new sectors, they are consistent with China's competitive advantages. So they are very competitive. They grow very fast. And this allows China to achieve stability and dynamic economic growth simultaneously. And in the new sectors, they can utilize the advantage of backwardness, so it can grow very fast. So that's the reason why China can achieve 9.9% growth. And the dynamic economic growth in the new sectors also create resources and conditions for China to reform the older sectors. For some reason, because with 9.9% growth rate for 3 decades, capital accumulation in China, went very fast. And so some of the firms in the past are not viable because China was a capital scarce economy. Now with more capital available, they become viable. So they become competitive, they can be profitable. And a few sectors which may not be China's competitive advantages, either the government will have enough resources to provide subsidies and protection, or could allow them to go bankrupt because the new sector creates a lot of jobs. And so if you have some firm go bankrupt, it will not cause the social problems. So that's the reason why the performance in China is much better than the performance in other transitional economies. In effect, in the 1980s, 1990s, there was a conviction in the academic circles. There was a conviction to say, well, planning economy was less efficient than market economy. But in that time, there's a conviction that the worst possible economy is a dual-track, gradual transitional economies. But not only China used this kind of dual-track approach to achieve remarkable performance, other transitional economies like Vietnam, Laos, their economic performance was much better than East European country, former Soviet Union. Again, they follow this kind of dual-track approach. Okay, this approach allowed China to achieve stability and dynamic economic growth simultaneously. But is there some cost for that? Certainly, there are some cost. And the cost demonstrated in several areas. One is the widening of income disparity in China. We know that before 1979, China was quite an egalitarian society. The income distribution was quite equal. And measured by index called the Gini coefficient, China at that time was only about 0.3 among the most equal society in the whole world. But by the time of the 1990s, the Gini coefficient in China reached about 0.45. And it reached the same level as in the Latin America countries. And people say, income disparity can be a root of social instabilities. And 0.45 is a threshold for that kind of instability. So that's one of the main challenges in China. And the second main challenge is that the saving and consumption, China saved a lot. And China the consumption as a percentage of Chinese GDP declined all the time. In the 1990s, consumption contributed to about 60% of China's GDP, now dropped down to about 35%. And the third problem in China is the external imbalances. China exports a lot, accumulates a lot of foreign reserve, and it creates huge imbalances in its external account. And all these are indicators of problems. And if China would not address this kind of issue, then certainly it can cause social, political, or conflicts with other countries. But what are the roots of the problem? From what I see, all these problems are the consequence of the dual-track approach. And all these problems related to the income distributions in China. And my analysis is that, as I said, in the dual-track approach, the Chinese government continue to provide some kind of subsidies and protection to the older sectors. And how the government provides subsidies and protections? The government retains certain distortion, intervention in the economic system. And one of the most intervention is in the financial sectors. We know that Chinese financial system is dominated by 4 big banks and equity markets. And the reason why China adopted those kind of financial system, because China need to provide subsidized fund to the capital-intensive, old, large, state-owned enterprises. And those kind of financial system only provide financial services to large companies. Many of them are state-owned. And now, because it's been listed in the stock market, so some of them are owned by rich people. But other small firms in manufacturing sectors, in service sectors, or in agricultural household, they will not get any financial services. So this kind of financial system favors the large companies or the company owned by the state or the rich people. Not only so, it is a representation of financial repression. Means what? The interest rate is controlled and artificially replaced. So those people who can get financial services, in effect, they get some kind of subsidies. Who subsidize them? Those people put their money into the financial system. They could not get financial services. In general, they are poorer. So if you ask the poor people to subsidize the growth of the state-owned enterprise or the rich people, certainly it will cause the income distribution to be widened. And similarly, in the mining sectors, all the mines, all the natural resources, according to constitutions, should belong to the nation. However, as a way to subsidize state mining companies, the Chinese government basically give the mining right free without charging the appropriate royalty. And in the past, all the mining companies are owned by the state. But after the transition, the mining sectors allow the private entry, allow joint ventures. And at the beginning, it was not a problem because the output price was controlled. So input prices was controlled, that's fine. But after the mid-1990s, output price were liberalized, linked to the international market prices. But the input prices, that is the royalty, the levy, and so on, are still almost free. So whoever who can get a right for mining, whoever immediately become billionaire. So that is cancels all income disparities. And the third one, related to monopoly in certain service sectors, like telecommunication, transportation, finance, and so on. And if you have monopoly, you have monopoly rent. And because of this kind of distortion, it causing the income distribution favor the rich people and also large companies. And we know that rich people, in general, their consumption propensity is low. That means that if they earn $1, and compared to a poor people earns $1, the rich people would not consume as much as the poor people marginally. And as a result, if you have a more income concentrated on the hand of the rich people, then their consumption as a percentage is low, their saving as a percentage will be high. And especially if you concentrate the income in the large corporation, their consumption percentage is even lower. And so the income distribution causing this kind of disparity between the saving and consumption or saving and investment. And if you invest a lot, and your domestic consumption absorption capacity is low, then you have a gap. Production capacity and absorption capacity, you have a gap. And that gap will be filled by external demand, that is export. And that is also the reason why China have larger trade surplus. So from this analysis, we find the roots of those kind of disparities in China, no matter its income distribution, or consumption and saving, or the export and the import, related to the legacies of this kind of dual-track transition. It provides stability and dynamic economic growth, but it causes this kind of disparities. So for China, it's very important to complete the transition from the dual-track economy to a well-functioning market economy in order to remove those kind of distortions and addressing the disparities in income, in consumption and saving, and in internal account and external account. And I think it's time for China to do that. I mentioned the reason why China needed to have those kind of transitory subsidies and protection, because in the 1970s, 1980s, or in the early 1990s, China was still a poor country. Capital was not available. And those kind of large corporations was in large-scale capital-intensive sectors. Without government subsidies and protections, either through financial sectors or mining sectors or the monopoly right, they are not viable. And if you allow them to go bankrupt, it will cause disruption, instability in China. But China now is a high middle-income country with per capita income of 6,000. Many of those kind of sectors become profitable. For example, car industry in the past used need to require huge protection. And now China can export cars by the private sectors, like Chile and so on. That means that China now has competitive advantage in those kind of sectors. And like equipments, machinery, in the past, it required protection. Now China is major providers of equipment in the world. So there's no need, there's no reason to remain those kind of subsidy and protection. China should eliminate those distortions to have allowed the Chinese economy to be a well-functioning economy. I'm encouraged because in the 12th five-year plan, as well as in the party Congress announcement, all those reform are the items in their agenda. Okay, if China continues this kind of transition and become a well-functioning economy, how long can China sustain this kind of high growth? I mentioned that there were 13 economies after the Second World War, achieved 7% and more growth rate continuously for 25 and more years. China now already achieved 9.9% growth rate, continuously for 32 years. How long can China continue this kind of growth rate? Well, how long depends on how large the advantage of backwardness is there. If the advantage of backwardness is still very high, then the potential to maintain dynamic economic growth will be large. If the advantage of backwardness is small, then the potential to achieve dynamic economic growth will be low. And in effect, the advantage of backwardness in China is still very high in spite of 32 years of 9.9% growth. Because the newest data that I have enabled me to do the cross-country and long-time historical analysis. It's the data set provided by Angus Madison. And the newest data was 2008. In 2008, the per capita income in China, measured by purchasing power parities, was 21% of US per capita income in that year. 21% of the US per capita income in 2008. And I think that the per capita income measured by purchasing power parities, it's a very good index of the level of technological sophistication, industrial advancement, and social economic institutions efficiency. Because per capita income reflects the average labor productivities. And in 2008, the per capita income in China was 21% of the US per capita income. It was the same as Japan in 1951. In that year, Japan's per capita income was 21% of the US per capita income. It was the same as Singapore in 1967, and as Taiwan in 1975, and the same as Korea in 1997. I mentioned there was 13 economies in the world after the Second World War tap into that advantage of backwardness and maintain dynamic economic growth. Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea were among those 13 economies. Okay. And for Japan, from 1951 to 1971, tapping into the potential advantage of backwardness, Japan maintained a 20 years of 9.2% growth rate. Singapore, from 67 to 87, by the similar drivers of dynamic economic growth, Singapore maintained 20 years of 8.6% growth rate. And Taiwan, by similar forces, from 1975 to 95, maintained 20 years of average 8.3% growth rate. And in Korea, from 77 to 97 to 97, 20 years of average 7.6% growth rate. And I mentioned these four economies were those 13 economies like China. And with the same potential, if they could maintain from 7.6% growth rate to 9.2% growth rate for 20 years, I think China has the potential from the advantage of backwardness to maintain another 20 years of average 8% growth rate. Another 20 years of 8% growth rate. Certainly, to realize that growth potential, China needs to do a lot of things, including complete the transition from a dual-track economy to a market economy. And in the process, China needs to balance the environmental challenges. China also needs to reform its social political institutions. But I think the potential is there. And I'm sure the leadership and the Chinese societies, they have the determination and the aspiration to tap into the potential in order to maintain the dynamic economic growth. If China can really tap into that potential and make that realized, what will be the pictures? In 1951, the per capita income in Japan was 21% of the US. by the time of 1971, the per capita income in Japan was 65% of the US per capita income. And after 20 years of dynamic economic growth, in Singapore, its per capita income increased from 21% to 54%. In Taiwan, after 20 years of dynamic growth, its per capita income increased from 21% to 53%. And again, for Korea, its per capita income increased from 21% to 50%. So if China can maintain the 8% growth rate in the coming 20 years, by the time of 2030, I predict the per capita income in China can be at least 50% of US per capita income, measured by purchasing power parity. But if we measure by market exchange rate, that will depend on how fast the Chinese currency revalued. Currently, the ratio between the market-based exchange rate and the purchasing power parity is about 2 to 1. So if by market exchange rate use the current exchange rate, at least by the time of 2030, the economic size in China will be, the per capita income in China will be at least 25% of the US per capita income. But we know that China has more than 4 times of the population in the US. So by the time of 2030, the economic size in China, measured by purchasing power parity, can be twice, at least, as large as the US. And measured by market exchange rate, at least, will be the same size as the US. Certainly, that will provide a lot of opportunities for young people here. Okay, my last question is that, certainly we hope the quest for prosperity that Chinese people, Chinese intellectuals pursued in the past 30 years, the experiences we gain, hopefully not only contribute to the Chinese people, we also hope it will contribute to people in other developing countries. Can other developing countries have a similar performance as China, as in the past 30 years? My answer is yes, if they have the right policies. Because for any country to have a sustained economic growth, the most important thing is a process of continuous technological innovation, industrial upgrading. It's the same for the high-income country and for the developing country. And all the developing countries have the advantage of backwardness during their technological innovation and industrial upgrading. If they know how to tap into the potential of that possibilities, I'm sure all the developing countries can achieve 8% growth rate, continuously for one generation, move their status from low income to medium status, and maybe by another generation from the middle income status to high income status. But to do that, they should follow a strategy first to develop their economy according to their competitive advantages, so they can be competitive. And by that, they can accumulate capitals, both human capital and physical capitals. And they can upgrade their industries and technologies. And the industrial upgrading and technology upgrading, they can benefit from the advantage of backwardness. And to do that, first, they need to have a well-functioning market system. So we'll provide the price signal to advise the private sectors which areas are their competitive advantages. And at the same time, the government need to play some kind of facilitation role during the industrial upgrading to provide the compensation for the first movers to do all the necessary coordinations. If they have this kind of system, on the one hand, rely on a market system and to have a facilitation state and develop their economy according to their competitive advantages in order to tap into the advantage of backwardness, every country will have the hope to maintain 8% growth rate or more continuously for one generation or even two generations, and to transform themselves from a poor agrarian economies like China in 79, and to a middle-income country in one generation, and continue to have a dynamic economic growth in another generation to become a high-income country. The hope is there. But most countries start their economy growth in an environment with all kinds of distortion, wrong intervention in the past. And this China also provides some useful lesson. If you have a lot of distortions in the past, the intention to remove those kind of distortion certainly is good, but it can cause more harm than good. So a pragmatic dual-track, gradual approach can provide stability and allow the economy to grow dynamically. And dynamic economic growth can create a condition for further reform in all the distortions. And that will allow the country to have a stability and to have a dynamic economic growth, to develop their economy according to their competitive advantages, and tap into the potential of advantage of backwardness. And recently, I published a few books. Okay, the first book is related to what I just talked about, the Chinese economy. I call that Demystifying the Chinese Economy, and the Chinese version of that called 解读中国经济. So I would recommend you to have a look at that book. Maybe you can borrow that from the library. And the second book is, try to provide my understanding of the process of economic development. And how come in this process that the important thing is understanding the nature of development, the nature of structural changes. And in this process, what's the appropriate role for the market and what's the appropriate role for the governments. And a third book called The Quest for Prosperity. In this book, I explain my idea about the new structural economics. And it also reflects my experiences as the chief economist of the World Bank. And it's quite readable. And the last book, called 本体and 常无, because I found, since the Second World War, almost all the countries in the European world, they wanted to modernize their nations. And it followed the policy recommendation based on the advanced theory developed in the high-income countries. And every country followed that approach failed. And a country where economy succeeded, like East Asian economy in the 1950s, 1960s, their policy were considered wrong based on the understanding of economic development at that time. And during the transition of China in the 1980s, 1990s, every country followed the standard policy recommendation from Washington, D.C., called the Washington Consensus failed. And China's approach was considered as the worst possible approach, but China was successful. Not only China, Vietnam, Laos, and Mauritius in the 1970s. So I think we need to have a reflection. We need to understand the reality, the challenges of developing countries. And in this understanding, the way for you to understand it is that you should not be influenced by the existing theory and experience in the past. And so you need to have an attitude I call 常无. You have nothing in your mind. And no theory in your mind. And it's a concept, it's a philosophy from Lao Tzu. 故常无欲，观其妙. And I published the book in Chinese when I was teaching at the Peking University before I went to World Bank. And, in my job, I found not only the Chinese people were influenced by the teaching, by the ideology from the West, and did all the things for the good purpose, but in the end, the bad result. And when the Chinese government, Chinese people want to do the right thing, many people criticize them doing the wrong thing, although the consequences are good. So we need to have those kind of new attitudes, new philosophies. And I found it was not the case in China. It was the case almost in every country. So I wanted to promote the Chinese philosophy. But I could not find an appropriate term for the translation of Changwu. And so, well, we use a lot of English terms in our Chinese. How come the Western people should also learn Chinese, right? So the translation, I use Benti and Changwu. And if you ask which book I like the best, this is the best book I like. So thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Lin, for sharing your insights. Professor Lin, please take the seat on stage. Today, Professor Lin has kindly agreed to take a few questions from our audience. So now may I invite Professor Junsen Zhang, Wai-Lun Professor of Economics and Chairman of the Department of Economics at CUHK, to moderate this Q&A section. So now if any of you would like to raise questions, please raise your hand, and our helpers will try to get you the microphone. Also, please be reminded to keep your questions short as possible so that we can accommodate more of them. Please.
Okay, I will go from here, then here, and then backwards again, okay?
Maybe I create 3 questions in each row first, and each
Okay.
one ask 1 question.
Okay, good idea, okay. Yeah, yeah, you go ahead, yeah. Identify yourself, please.
Thank you for lecture. My name is Nobuki Nakamura. I am an excellent student from Japan. And recently, the relationship between Japan and China have been worsened. And however, the China and Japan are interconnected both economically and politically. And what prospect do you have the relationship between China and Japan in the future?
I'd like to create 3 questions first before I answer.
Okay, so one from middle, yes.
My name is K.L. Wong. I'm a Chinese University alumni. First of all, I'd like to thank you for sharing your insights into the Chinese economy. That was one of the, I think, best speech I've listened to recently. Really thank you, I appreciate that. You rightly point out that for China to go to the next stage, to sustain a high growth rate of 8% or above, then China needs to continue to transition itself into more market economies. But you also rightly pointed out that right now, the vested interest in China, who actually got the subsidies directly or indirectly from the country, are the powerful SOEs, the large listed companies, and the rich people. Now, these are they have really powerful vested interests. Now, can you share with us your insight into this area? How China's economic policies have been formulated in the past, right? At least very successfully in the past. How are these changes in economic policies going to be formulated, particularly under the new leadership announced today? And then when do you expect that these bold reforms will start to be rolled out? Thank you.
So, one from this side.
Hello, my name is Ryan, and I'm a postgraduate student from the School of Journalism and Communication. And I want to ask you also about the growth rate of 8%. And my question is, can you tell me that what are the key points to support the 8% growth rate, and in which industries do you think they will support the 8% growth, except the basic facilities and also the real estate in China? And also, I want to know that what do you think are China's competitive advantages? Thank you very much.
Okay, I have 3 questions, and all very good questions. The first one related to the tension between China and Japan regarding the Diaoyu Dao. And I think it's very unfortunate because we know that the stage of development in Japan is higher than the stage of the China's development. So economically, there's a lot of complementarity between China and Japan. If China grows continuously, China need to import a lot, China need to rely on investment, a lot of capital-intensive technology equipment, and those kind of technology and equipment are mostly imported from Japan. And if Chinese people become richer, Chinese people will upgrade their consumption, their goods, and so on. A lot of those kind of more sophisticated goods are imported from Japan also. So the growth in China benefit Japan. And Japanese technology equipment benefit China's development also. But we know that Japanese economy did not do well in the past 20 years. Japan has lost decades. And some politicians, they try to use external tension to gain their political benefit at the cost of Japanese people. And those kind of policy is very dangerous. Because I think Deng Xiaoping is the smartest person in the world. They put aside the dispute, and let's develop our economy jointly. I think that's the best policies. But some politicians in Japan, they did not want to put the dispute aside. They want to say, well, we don't have the dispute because this belongs to us. But historic evidence is so obviously. It belongs to China in the past. And it was occupied by Japan by the colonialism. And it was transferred the administrative right from the US illegally to Japan after the US ending the occupation of Japan. And US recognized that. But some politicians, for their own political gain, try to jeopardize the relation between China and Japan, and the possibility for prosperity in China and Japan. So we should make this clear to the Japanese people as well. And I hope that you understand that. And so you carry the message. I'm sure the best way is the proposal by Deng Xiaoping. We recognize currently the administrative right was under Japan, illegally transferred by the US, but we recognize that the facts. And currently the most important thing is for the Japanese economy to have economic recovery. The most important thing is for China to have economic growth. So that's commonly develop our economy, put aside our dispute. Maybe in the future generation, they are smarter, they will find a good way to solve the issue. Then coming to the question about, will the state-owned enterprises or large corporations became vested interest and became a hurdles for China's economic reform. And I'd like to say, vested group of people exists anytime in any country. At the beginning of the reform in 1979, there were many vested interest people also. For example, at that time, in the Chinese cabinet, there were 8 ministers represented heavy industries. Because at that time, China had 1级部到8级部, they are all ministers. And certainly, they have their vested interest. And in the countryside, there was a commune system. And all the director of the commune are Tu Huangdi, local emperor. And they have their own vested interests also. But it's very important that every political leaders, they have some room of freedom. If they see something which is important for the prosperity of the nation, and they understand if taking this action will be in the common interest of the people, I'm sure all the political leaders, they have the room to make the necessary changes. And if you read the party Congress document, in this time they emphasize the important so-called 顶层设计, the design from the top leaders or the central government, and to remove the distortions, and to avoid being captured by different vested interest groups. So I'm hopeful. Certainly, China always wants to maintain stabilities, because without stability, it's impossible to have a development. But China also understands growth is the best way for solving the problem in China, and that is also reflected in the party Congress, right? 发展是解决一切问题的最终手段. So I'm sure that, as you can see, a lot of reform I recommend. For example, the financial sector reform. Now the Chinese government, started to liberalize the control interest rate. And also the Chinese government started to promote the development of small and local financial institutions. And that is in the right directions. Chinese government also talk about the necessity to levy the appropriate tax on the mining sectors. And Chinese government also have a document to facilitate the entry of private sector to some monopoly sector in the past. So I think it's all in the right directions. But how fast China can implement those kind of reform? It depends on domestic economic situation. It also depends on the external economic situation. If we have a global downturns, and certainly you need to move fast, and large enterprises can move faster, and a lot of those large enterprises are state-owned, and so you appear to be state-owned sectors, play increasing role during the past few years. But it was a special situation. But direction of reform is so clear in China. So I'm confident that those 8% growth rate, the potential layer, and the government understands that, and they try to tap into the potential. So if you can read, the party Congress set a new target for China, right? By the time of 2020, the per capita income in China will double based on compared to 2010. And doubling per capita income means the average annual growth rate will be 7.2%. It's close to the 8% growth rate, as I just indicated, right? And the last question about the 8% growth rate, which industry that will be the new industries? Well, I think we have the business school here, right? You may have to ask the professor in business school. They can answer those kind of sector industry better than I do. Overall, it will be more capital intensive than China have now. Because the industrial upgrading diversification means you always need to move to sectors which are more capital intensive because your wage rate rising. And to compensate for the rising wages, you need to allow each worker to use more capitals, both human capital and physical capitals. And it will be more sophistication. But which one will be that requires careful analysis? But that is a process, and I'm sure that is the reason why I think we need to have a competitive market and in order to provide the price signals and also the pressure for industrial upgrading. Regarding the real estate, my analysis about the real estate, you need to distinguish two types. China is still on the stage of urbanization because currently the rate of urbanization in China is only about 51% of the population living in the urban areas. Compared to other countries, at a similar stage of development, their urbanization rate is about 70% or 75%. So there's a huge scope for China to go more urbanizations. And certainly, when you move people from the rural area to urban areas, they need to have housing. And the real estate should be very important as a sector to accommodate the needs. But at the same time, we also need to avoid real estate become a target for speculation, a target for all kinds of bubbles. Because we know all the financial crises, at the end, all related to the real estate bubble and the burst of real estate bubble. So China needs to be careful steering this process. On the one hand, real estate will continue to play a very important role in China's development, in the process of urbanization. But China needs to avoid that turning into a bubble economies in order to prevent, to preempt the possible crisis in the financial sectors. I think I answered your question, so maybe we can collect 3 more questions.
Oh, okay, now we move the middle row because we took the 3 in the very front. So anyone from there?
We have from our West friend.
Okay.
Western friend.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another exchange student, maybe.
That's
Please
correct.
identify yourself.
Thank you very much for your lecture. My name is Marcus, and I'm from the Netherlands. And my question concerns the potential of further pro-poor growth in China, because you were pointing out that so far the growth has been massively pro-poor. Poverty was reduced, but there's still a substantial number of poor people left in China. And I was wondering how you view this potential of further economic growth in China to reduce poverty. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so
We should also give professor opportunities.
Professor Lin, thank you for the lecture and welcome back to Hong Kong since the World Bank assignment. I was going to ask you economic question, but I thought I promise you I'll read your book and maybe I'll get some answer from those. I would like to take this precious opportunity to ask you, how is it like in working for World Bank? Can you share us maybe a day in the life of a World Banker, chief economist? The second question is, we have BRIC countries that are exemplary of developing country. My question is, will Africa, for example, be ever as important as these BRIC countries? Thank you very much, Professor Lin.
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you. I'm Jacob. I'm currently the 4th year in the CUHK, a major in quantitative finance. So I want to ask, is the current, previous fiscal stimulus a concern for you, such as in 2009, the 4 trillion stimulus package, which created a lot of high inflation and huge local government debt and overcapacity problem, and the central government is still approving a lot of projects on airports, like railway, things like that this year. So is it a concern for you to support your 8% growth in the next 20 years? Thank you.
Okay, all 3 are quite good questions again. And the first one about the further poverty reduction in China. And I think the way to do it is that, on the one hand, continue to promote growth, because you need to make the cake bigger in order to have more to distribute. And secondly, you need to divide the cake more evenly. And so the low-income people, they can benefit more from the economic development. How to do that? And the way to do that is to complete the transition from a dual-track economies to a well-functioning market economies. Because if China moves to a well-functioning economies, then China will develop its economy more in line with China's competitive advantages. And for China, at this stage, compared to the high income countries. The low wage, the wage cost is still relatively low compared to Japan, compared to Korea, compared to the US, or even to Taiwan. And by that, China will develop those kind of industries which can create a lot of jobs. And that will allow the poor people to get jobs. And the most important way to help the poor people is allow them to have jobs. That's one thing. And then secondly, if China develop the economy according to the competitive advantages, in my talk I mentioned, it will make China the most competitive. And so it can create a large number of jobs. At the same time, that will allow China to accumulate capital the fastest way. And so capital will turn from relatively scarce to relatively abundant. Labor force will turn from relatively abundant to relatively scarce. You came from Netherlands, right? Netherlands has huge population density, right? But you have labor shortage, right? Again, so if we develop our economy very rapidly, although we have a lot of number of people, but it creates so much jobs, so many jobs. So labor force will become relatively scarce. And then by that, the wage rate will increase very rapidly. And the return to capital will decline. And we know that rich people earn their income mostly from capital. Poor people earn their income mostly from their wages. And then by this way, you can see the asset, that is their labor force, owned by the poor people become increasingly valuable. And the asset owned by the rich people becomes increasingly less valuable. So in this process, you can achieve dynamic economic growth. You make the pie, the cake bigger. And then you, in the income distribution, you will favor the poor people. And I think that's the way to reduce poverty, to address the issue of income disparities. Secondly, my life in the World Bank. I know people will ask my question like that, so I have a book called The Quest of Prosperities. And that has a lot of description about, reflection about my life in the World Bank. Very interesting, because I went to the World Bank. At the beginning, I thought my main job was to help the poor country. But I arrived in June 2008. And September 2008, the global financial crisis erupted. Certainly, I needed to help the poor people. But all of a sudden, I also need to help the rich people. And my quest for prosperity reflects my thinking about how to help the poor people. In fact, I have another book coming out. And telling how to help the rich people. It's already available in Chinese called 从西潮到东风. It's available in Chinese called 从西潮到东风. And it will be published by the Cambridge University Press later this year. And the title for the English version is Beyond Keynes. I try to provide some solution for that. That's my life in the World Bank. And whether the African country can be as successful as a BRIC country. Well, in terms of growth rate, they can. I give you one example, Rwanda, a poor, landlocked African countries. They achieved 9.8% growth rate continuously from 1994 to now. 9.8% growth rate for 17 years already. China, 9.9% for 32 years, right? So they almost reached the same level. And I think they have the potential. How come I'm so confident? Their president came to China to participate in the World Economic Forum Summer Davos in Tianjin. And he read my book. And he was intrigued because he wanted to have the similar success as in China, right? So he made an appointment to see me. And but unfortunately, I already pre-committed to go to Uzbekistan because the president there also wanted to read this book and to understand how to turn their country into a tiger. And I said, well, I could not because I already promised to go to Uzbekistan. And the government set up a meeting for me and so on. And he stayed in China for 2 days, just for the purpose of meeting me. If a president would stay in a foreign country for 2 days to meet an academic, this country will be successful. And not only Rwanda, many other, like Ethiopia, Tanzania, Zambia, Mozambique, they all read my book. So I think in terms of growth rate, they will be. But whether they will become BRIC country or not, that depends on their size, right? The BRIC country, not only the growth rate is high, but also the population size is large. And also in African country, some country has the potential to become another BRICS. South Africa is already one, and Nigeria is another one, Ethiopia, because they have population close to 100 million or more than 100 million. So I think there's a potential. If they have the right policies, no matter they are small countries or they are big countries, they can all grow dynamically. And the last one about the fiscal stimulus in 2008, and it caused, some inflation, it caused some local government debt, and based on that, some famous economists like Khomeini predict Chinese economy will collapse in 2013. He was so certain, right? Did you read some? I think it was influenced by Khomeini and so on, because he became very famous because people thought he predicted the collapse of the 2008. And now he predicts the Chinese economy is going to collapse in 2013. But I think that this time, he will found it to be incredible. In a sense that you had to compare, yes. China adopted a very strong fiscal stimulus in 2008. But we need to compare the alternative. If China did not carry out that stimulus, what would be the consequence? We know the shock was so large. At the end of 2008, beginning of 2009, there were more than 20 million workers being left off because of the export market collapse. And if there were more than 20 million people losing their job, what would be the consequence? So certainly the government to do some kind of fiscal stimulus is the right thing to do, because it used the investment as a way to generate the demand, to create jobs. And I think most of those kind of investment will be good investment. Because for Khomeini to predict those kind of investment would be bad investment, because his experiences is in the US. In the US, in general, the growth rate will be around 3%. And then he based his calculation, if the economic growth rate is 3%, then the demand for those kind of highways, for those kind of speed train, will be very small. And it took a long time to generate enough profit or revenue to pay back the debt. But if the Chinese economy maintained 8% or more, as I predict, then in a few years, the demand will be so strong, it will be overcrowded. And I personally have some experiences. Like in 1998, during the East Asian financial crisis, China also adopted a stimulus package. And most of those stimulus package was used for building highways, airport, right? And I can give you some figures. At the beginning of 2008, at the beginning of 1998, the highway system in China was only 4,700 kilometers. And by the time of 2002, it increased 5 times to 25,100 kilometers, 5-time increase. At the beginning, you can find a lot of highways did not have car. For example, Beijing, the city where I lived. Before 98, Beijing had only one highway, from Beijing to Tianjin to Tanggu. And after 98, Beijing built 6 other highways. At the beginning, you went to other 6 highways, there was no car. There were so beautiful highways, but there was no car. I was very worried how the local government collect enough revenue to pay for those highways. But now they are all overcrowded. And similarly related to 四环路, 五环路, 六环路. At the beginning, there was no car, but now they are all overcrowded. And so I think that a lot of local governments, investment in those kind of infrastructure, instead of being a burden for the growth, they create a condition, release the bottleneck for growth. And I can give another figure to support my argument. From 1979 to 2000, the average growth rate in China was 9.6% per year. At that time, people thought it was possible for China to continue those kind of growth rate because China already maintained 9.6% for 21 years, right? From 1979 to 2000. And I mentioned Japan maintained 9.2% growth rate only for 20 years. After that, it all declined. So most people argue in 2000, the growth rate in China could not maintain at 9.6%. China must drop down to 8%, 7%. But from 2000 to 2010, the growth rate in China not only did not decline, it was increased to 10.8%, 1.2% higher. And not only so, before 2000, every time the Chinese economy grew at 2 digits, more than 10%, the inflation rate would also be 2 digits. Like in 1987, 1988, the inflation rate in China was 18%. 93, 94, the inflation rate was 23, 24%. But from 2000 to 2010, the average growth rate was 10.8%, but the highest inflation rate in China is only 5%. And how come in the past, as long as you have 1 or 2 years of 2-digit growth rate, you must have 2-digit inflation rate. Now you have 10 years of 2-digit growth rate, your inflation rate is so low. It was because of the bottleneck of the growth was released by those kind of infrastructure investment. And I'm sure the infrastructure investment now will have the same function as the infrastructure investment in the 1998, 1990, 2000, and so on. And this is also the reason why I promote my book, 本体 and 常务. Because if you want to understand the problems, certainly theory or past experiences may give you some references, but it can be a burden also, because it will give you some kind of glasses. Those kind of, it may blind you in some way to understand the new phenomena. So it's better to understand the problem. For example, people worry about the local financing for those kind of infrastructure investment may turn into the bad loans. It can be an issue, I agree. But we need to analyze whether the demand in the future will be large enough to generate the revenue to pay for those kinds of debt. Then we need to analyze the growth potential and how to unleash those kind of growth potential. If you find the local government, the central government, try to unleash those kind of growth potential, then you can have competence. Those kind of investment will be good investment, And well, 10 years from now, I can come back to again, and you can ask me the same questions. And you can see whether my judgment is right or wrong. Okay.
Okay, unfortunately or fortunately, Professor Lin has to go to a place for dinner, not quite far from here. So last question now. Perhaps I give to the front row.
Thank you very much, Professor Lin, for the wonderful lecture, and Chinese you for hosting it. I'm Manuel Troconis, Consul General of Venezuela in Hong Kong, and I would like to ask, in the scenario of a world with limited resources and many threats like global warming, pollution, what do you think was the role of the one-child policy for the China success, and how do you address the issue of growth economy versus steady-state economy for the future?
Actually, you are asking three questions. One is one-child policy. The other one is resources limitation. The third one is global warming. And I think for the one-child policies, I think that it was a policy, adopted by the Chinese government in the 1970s and 1980s. At that time, China was a poor country, and the Chinese government understood if China wanted to develop the economy, we need to create a job, we need to make investment. And if you allow people to have, 3, 4, 5 children, then it will be a heavy pressure on the Chinese government, on the Chinese society. So China adopted one-child policies. But that policy benefited the growth at that time. But it makes China to facing the challenge of aging sooner. And I think it is time for China to reconsider the policy now. Because now Chinese economy grows so fast, Chinese people save so much, and China is facing the constraint of aging. So I think the Chinese government can reconsider the policy now and maybe relax a little bit. And the second one is about resources. I think resources may not be a constraint for China's growth or for any other country's growth. Because I think many people here are old enough to remember a book called The Limit to Growth, published by the Roman Club in 1960s. And according to that book, by the time of 2000, all the resources in the world, including oil, gas, and iron, copper, and also would all be depleted. But now 2012, we still have so many resources there. And I think that because, yes, the growth in China, the growth in India, the growth in other developing countries will demand more resources. And the prices of resources will go up. When the prices of resources go up, it will induce several adaptations. One, people will use those kind of resources more economically and more efficient. That will reduce the demand for resources. And secondly, it will induce all kinds of technological innovations and to find alternative resources. And third, it will also encourage new explorations to find new deposit, new mining, and so on. And just give you one example. In the past, when the energy prices was at $20 per barrel, US imported a lot of oils, right? And for that purpose, even US engaged in war in Middle East to safeguard the secure the access to gas, to oil. Now, when oil price increase, so there's a lot of new technology and a new exploration in the US. Now, US find natural gas in the US was so abundant. And the US basically can self-sufficient in its energy now. So I think that the price mechanism will induce either finding more resources or find technological innovation or encourage people to save. So I don't think that will be a limitation. The last one about the global warming. The global warming can be a real danger. And it can be demonstrated by the frequency of disasters, extraordinary weather conditions, and so on. So it's very important for every nation to try some effort to face these challenges and to encourage new ways of growth. And luckily, the new party Congress also put that into the agenda. So now China wanted to have Sengtai Wenmin as the fifth item of China's policy platform. So I hope China will be a new leaders in the new growth pattern in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you both professors. Now to show our appreciation, may I invite our Vice Chancellor, Professor Joseph Song, to present a souvenir to Professor Lin.